So the reason we like the LAL, right, it allows us accuracy. Light adjustable lens eyes have a 14 and a half times higher chance of hitting within a half diopter of target. Now, compared to standard monofocal lenses. Now, if you actually look at toric lenses, so the plot here over on the left, that's standard monofocal lenses, and then light adjustable lenses on the right. Looking at toric lenses, so taking into account an astigmatism or an astigmatic approach, we're actually getting about 8.6 times more likely within a half diopter of sphere and cylinder, based on postoperative refraction. So the LAL plus, for those who are unaware, it is very similar. It's probably more similar than it really is different compared to the light adjustable lens. The big difference is that it does have a little bit more central asphericity to it. So while you're really not giving a whole lot up, you're really not inducing a whole lot of negative, what you are getting out of that is a broadened depth of focus. And so we can see that in the defocus curve. So the advantage here is that we're improving our uncorrected near visual acuity. And what tends to happen, and especially my clinical appearance, I'm sure Seamus and Eva, you guys can probably contribute here too. Both eyes work more as a team. You're preserving depth of focus. You're preserving binocularity, and isometropia is less of an issue. So for patients who come in and they're like, well, man, I haven't worn my contacts, monovision contacts were just a disaster for me. Those patients do very well with the light adjustable lens, and they do arguably even better with the light adjustable lens plus, because you are preserving more depth of focus, and both eyes work better as a team. So getting down to the nitty-gritty, the numbers. This is coming from several studies. So there's the FDA post-approval study. There's 335 eyes. Probably a lot of people on the call actually were a part of the study. 14 clinics were enrolled, as well as the LAL data registry, which includes over 1,057 eyes implanted with LAL, 955 of which were emmetropic targets, and over 101 clinics enrolled, as well as the light adjustable lens plus data registry, which has 407 patients. So we're looking at a pretty big data set when we look at these numbers. And we're looking at visual outcomes. That's the name of the game, visual outcomes. So light adjustable lens versus light adjustable lens plus, monocular distance corrected vision. So we're optimally correcting for distance. There really was not much of a difference between the light adjustable lens plus and the LAL. And the thought was, because of that central asphericity with the LAL plus, is there going to be a compromise at distance? And now looking back at the data that we've gathered over the last year, not really. You're really not giving a whole lot up. Now, what you are gaining out of that, from that central asphericity, you are improving at intermediate at 66 centimeters, and you're definitely improving at near, so at 40 centimeters. So you're really not giving a whole lot up, but you are getting something in return. And I think what's most important is really not getting the glare and the halos that you would with a traditional EDOF IOL or a multifocal lens. So you are getting something without giving a whole lot up, really splitting those hairs. Now, binocular uncorrected distance vision, kind of the same question, different way of putting it. So proportion of patients who are achieving 20/20 at distance uncorrected. 90.4% of patients in the registry were uncorrected 20/20 binocularly, which is comparable between the LAL plus and the LAL. So really no statistically significant difference at a distance uncorrected. Also, obviously great to see. Intermediate, we do start to see a little bit of a difference. So the proportion of patients having 20/20 or better uncorrected intermediate vision, so vision at 66 centimeters, was significantly improved, although maybe not a crazy amount, but improved nonetheless, LAL plus compared to the LAL. And now reading that difference is a little bit more pronounced. We are seeing a more dramatic improvement up close for binocularly uncorrected near vision patients, LAL plus compared to the LAL. So basically, to summarize again, monocularly, we have similar distance accuracy. We have similar binocular corrected visual acuity. The LAL plus is just a little bit better distance corrected at intermediate and near. And then binocularly, we have similar uncorrected, but the LAL plus is just a little bit better uncorrected intermediate and up at close.
Nick, can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's really kind of a celebration of LAL, because I know that it's wonderful to see that the difference between distance is minimal to none for LAL versus LAL plus. I think we do have to consider that I think a lot of our doctors are picking LAL for patients with, post-refractive corneas, perhaps keratoconic corneas, or just corneas that are a little more challenging, and perhaps picking LAL plus for more, more normal / virgin corneas. And so just a little bit of a different set of patients that are being chosen for those, for LAL versus LAL plus, maybe more challenging corneas than LAL plus. So seeing that their distance acuities ended up being, pretty comparable, is really actually exciting for LAL to see how well those patients are getting corrected with those extremely challenging corneas.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is really a celebration. These numbers are, I mean, when you really look at them, they're pretty impressive. The dynamic nature of the lens, how good we can get somebody to see. I mean, we're getting patients to macular potential. And Evie, you're totally right. I mean, the LAL, we tend to self-select, and we'll get into this probably a little bit more a little later, when we use the LAL versus the LAL plus. But in our practice, we tend to keep the LAL plus for more pristine corneas. And the LAL, the traditional standard LAL first generation, is more for, well, anybody really, but especially patients who have issues, macular pathology, cornea pathology, irregularities. So you're probably right there, but it is a celebration. Now, I think the one hypothesis that I had when LAL plus came out last year is, well, because you're getting more depth of focus, there's really two things we could consider. Are we going to have to go less myopic in the non-dominant eye to achieve a desired goal? Or can we go further and still regain and retain depth perception? So looking back at all the data in both registries, the observed average myopic target for the non-dominant eye in an LAL was 1.1 compared to 0.91. So we're going almost 0.2 diopters less myopic. Eva, Seamus, is that something that's consistent with what you guys do in your practice, what you're seeing?
I do think I see that it's less myopic endpoints with the LAL plus, but I think a lot of the times in real life, it might even be less than this. On average, I think closer, like in our own practice, I know this is from a few studies out there, but I think a little bit less myopia for each, the first gen LAL and the LAL plus, probably maybe like -1 and -0.5 is kind of like where I try to get it to. So I'd say, yes, that's fairly average and maybe even less myopia than that.
Yeah. That's what I see too, usually. I mean, we're really not pushing in. I don't think we really have to. There's a couple of data points coming up here that would really kind of highlight that. The other data point here too, the proportion of patients that are 1.25 or less was obviously significantly higher for the LAL plus. So you just don't have to go as far. And I think this graph really highlights a unique thing that is a bit of a surprise, but it makes sense. So with our light adjustable lens, we have that in the purple line there. That is a less EDOF-ish, I guess we could call it. It's got less asphericity to it. And so it's more of a linear graph. So the more myopic you go, the more the higher level of uncorrected near visual acuity you go. That makes sense, right? If you're a -1, that would make sense that you can see better up close versus a -0.5. Now, the LAL plus, because of its asphericity, because of the depth of focus that it has inherent in it, there is almost a point at which you don't get as much benefit. So there's a bit of a plateau. And Seamus, just like you said, I mean, you find that you go -0.5, -0.75. That's kind of where we go. And if you actually look at the green graph here, at about -0.75, that's where you start to really not improve much. You don't see as much improvement. So I think we learned early on when we started doing the LAL plus, we thought that it operated like a monofocal lens, or a little bit more like a monofocal lens, in that it had this more linear graph where the more myopic you go, the better it's going to be, right? That's not always the case. And I have had patients where we've pushed them early on and they find that there's more anisometropia there. There's almost a bit more of a compromise than we expected. So really the need to go past 3/4 is not that, we really don't have to do that often. But the LAL traditional, moving in that linear way, I mean, you do, the further you go, the more myopia, the more improved near vision you'll have. Now, the flip side of that coin is then you're having more anisometropia and you're inducing a true monovision. And we don't use the term monovision in our clinic. We call it blended vision because the eyes do work better as a team the closer that they are. If you isolate them more, it becomes more of a monovision, like a contact lens monovision, where typically the non-dominant eye is sacrificed by about 2 diopters, give or take. But that's a more true monovision approach. So what we're looking at here, Eva and Seamus and a lot of people here know, with the LAL plus, or with the LAL specifically, we do have the ability to add an optional negative asphericity to it. So since the nomogram changed a few months ago with the LAL plus, we really don't have that anymore. We don't have the ability to add the negative spherical aberration. But what this shows is that even when we did have the option to add the negative asphericity, this is the LAL plus without the optional add and the LAL plus with the optional add, there was really not much of a change. Maybe a small reduction so let's say that you had a plano set eye, but you induced the negative spherical aberration as an option. You may give up a letter or two, which is not much, but it is something. However, there's really not a huge decline in distance visual acuity, but you do get a little bit more benefit at high myopia. And that's kind of what this graph shows. But I think the highlight here is that there's really not much different all the way through our normal range of myopia. So it does start to split at about 1.5 diopter of myopia spherical equivalent. But again, like we just talked about, how often do we go that far in the myopic range? We really don't that often. That kind of, again, highlights that the negative spherical aberration that you can add as an option doesn't affect the distance visual acuity that much. Now, here's what we're getting. Same idea, the LAL plus with the spherical aberration versus without it. We have a benefit of that in the lower myopia range, but then we have a little more of a compromise the further down the slope we go. So the further myopia we induce with the added optional negative spherical aberration, that's where we start to get a little bit of a compromise. But again, that comes at about 1 1/4. And so what we found in our clinic that we really have to go negative 1 1/4 for a myopic set LAL plus. So I wanted to highlight some data that I crunched from our clinic over the last calendar year. So from January 2024 to December 31st, 2024, we did over 300 total, but this is the data that I was able to collect 2 months post-lock for those patients that were implanted that year. Our data was highly consistent with the registries that I just showed. So our average deviation, we know that the LAL plus and the LAL are both accurate, 0.16 to 0.173 at our target. So we're within a quarter diopter most of the time. The other thought that we hypothesized with the LAL plus is that maybe we'd get done a little faster with the plus compared to the traditional LAL. And sure enough, yeah, we had about a 5-day difference. Seamus and Eva, do you guys find that the LAL plus you can get done faster? Do you find that you reach your target faster?
Actually, I would say yes. In the last 3 to 4 months specifically, I think the average number of visits for LAL plus is almost 1 treatment, 2 locks, so 3 visits for that. I can think of probably 10 to 12 patients off the top of my head that was the case for. And I know we mix and match the two a little bit, but I've starting to see that the clearer corneas with the LAL plus in it actually are less visits overall. And I think maybe Dr. Kim can attest to that as well.
Yeah, I would say that when I'm counseling my patients, I take every opportunity possible because we usually plan. 88%, I think, of patients nationally are picking blended vision. We see a similar trend in our clinics. And so our patients are motivated to have as little dependence on glasses after surgery as possible. So they're in for the blend. And if their corneas are healthy, usually pristine, I will encourage LAL plus in the non-dominant eye. I do tend to not aim for hyperopia in that eye. I'll kind of be close, like first minus. I won't go two minus, but I'll go first minus so that it's almost like since they're waiting 3 weeks before their first treatment, they're already kind of practicing with an LAL in their non-dominant eye with the LAL plus it has that extended depth of focus. And so they're kind of forced to get used to it, if that makes sense. And then, and these are patients who I might be a little bit worried about actually, because they haven't done monovision and I want to see if they can adjust to it. And they're kind of convinced maybe that they're not going to adjust to it, but also very motivated. So Seamus, you're really great at, just peppering in, kind of, bringing them to maybe the next point of minus or kind of, just doing just a very minor treatment, a quarter at most. And I think that they've already kind of gotten used to having a little myopia there. They've got their extended depth of focus, and you kick in a little bit more of that ad, and then they're super happy. So, and then their other eye, their dominant eye, is oftentimes I will pick an LAL plus. I'll suggest an LAL not plus, just an LAL for their for their dominant eye, so that they can have that pristine distance. We have some patients where we will do LAL plus in both eyes, and those tend to be our younger patients who come in with high hyperopia or high myopia and are there for refractive lens exchange and are somewhat pretty adamant that they do not want to have monovision of any kind, blended vision of any kind. And so I like to do LAL plus for them so that they will have that extended depth of focus, and that maybe Seamus could, again, pepper in just a little, the most minimum amount of minus, so that they might not even notice in their non-dominant eye, and get them a little bit less dependent on readers, for instance. Sorry, long answer, guys.
No, excellent insight. I mean, the thing about the LAL too, it's not a true monofocal. I mean, there is about a diopter, I think it's 1.4 diopters of depth of focus inherent in it without the optional add. So you can add a little more depth of focus to the standard LAL to get another maybe quarter-ish, and then with a little bit of handiwork by Seamus, we can just kind of blend it in just enough. And the LAL plus, it has about 1.6 in it, and that's about the equivalent of a Vivity. I mean, the Vivity is a great lens, and it does have depth of focus to it. So if you're already getting 1.6 diopters of depth of focus with a little subtle kind of nudge in the myopic direction, you can do pretty handy work, and you don't have to go all the way to $1.25, a buck and a half. That tends to be too far for most people. So with the plus, back to the original, the note here, a question that just came through was the average number of days until lock counting the operation day. Yes. So what I have here is from surgery until final lock-in. That's what that is. With the LAL, we have to be a little more careful about where our final target is. The distance eye is going to be plano. That's always going to be plano. You always want that as your, not always, but for most of the time, most of my patients want at least one eye to be plano. So you know where that target's going to be. But the near set eye, that's a moving target. So I always use golfing as an analogy. It's like we're putting on a golf course. Well, the hole sits where it sits. Now, with the near eye, if we're putting, we have the luxury of moving that hole. If we don't like where it's at, we can move that hole wherever we want it to be to make it easier on ourselves. But it's a moving target. And so for the LAL, because there's not as much depth of focus, that hole is a little bit smaller. And so we have to be a little bit more precise with hitting it. The LAL plus, we have a bigger hole. We don't have to be as accurate because depth of focus works in two directions, both plus and minus. And so we tend to reach that final endpoint faster. And I was suspicious of that. And actually, when I looked at my spreadsheet and actually ran the numbers, sure enough, yeah, we're about 5 days faster. And then again, to add to the previous point, the average near target with the LAL plus, we are definitely less. It's not a lot, but it is significant, about a 0.12 diopters, so an eighth of a diopter, less myopic on average with their LAL plus. Now, that's not for everybody, but for most of my patients, we are getting less. So just a couple little final points with some clinical pearls here, and this is not just my clinical pearls. This is a number of surgeons and optometrists who are involved in this kind of brain trust on what to do or how to do it. And we'll talk about this again after we kind of go through these. So lens selection, this is true for our practice, especially. We use LAL eyes for eyes that we could normally do a monofocal or a single toric vision, toric lens. The LAL plus we tend to view as an eye that could handle a Vivity or a multifocal, some sort of depth of focus or multifocal lens. These are eyes that are healthier, no comorbidities, no large angle kappa. They're less likely to be targeted with significant myopia. So our patients who are not, extreme, they don't have a huge a potential for compromise. We stick with the LAL plus for those, but eyes that do have comorbidities, they have macular pathology, they have glaucoma, significant dry eye, then we'll stick with the LAL. Surgical planning, our A constant 119.1, and we're targeting plano. You don't have to use the old A constant 118.4 where you kind of had to expect to end up a little bit more hyper. With the new A constant, you target plano and you get it pretty accurately. The IOL centration is definitely more important for the LAL plus because of that asphericity. We do need to make sure that that lens is perfectly centered. Our LDD targeting, our distance eye is always going to be plano. Keep in mind, especially if you're refracting in a short lane, that we sometimes can be a little bit over minus. So being a little plus is not a problem. So if you end up at -1/4 in your short lane, in the real world, that behaves like -1/4 to a -1/2. So you tend to be more myopic than we expect. So if you're plano or even on the plus side, that's not a bad thing. Those patients are usually more comfortable with their distance visual acuity. Now, in the myopic near eye, just like I mentioned, that we don't have to go that far. So with the LAL plus, -0.75 on average, I wouldn't go much more than -1, -1.25 seldomly. But the LAL, you can be a little more comfortable going a little farther. You may have to get that patient's desired visual outcome. So for the LDD, so the technique pros, make sure you've dilated. That's a no-brainer. You got to be able to see the lens. You need to see both haptics and an edge. You want to avoid putting too much pressure with the contact lens and vignetting. Vignetting is where we're obscuring the view of the camera, basically, or the view of the light delivery device with the edge of the lens. Use the pattern assist if able, and then focus on the haptics. The haptics are your Z target. So you can see X and Y, the Z is your haptic. You want to make sure that you're a proper depth. And then active shield. I get this question all the time. Do you really have to wear the glasses? You really do outdoors, and every clinic's different, but the active shield does provide redundant protection, but it's not the whole thing. And it does wear off over time with UV exposure. So it's not really a time per se that wears it off, but it's UV exposure cumulatively. So lock-in is still required. You can't just do your third treatment and then that patient can disappear. You do have to lock it in because the active shield only provides redundant.